Our first learning objective is to understand the basic approach in activity-based costing and how it differs from our conventional costing, in other words, the costing system we were using back in Chapter 2. When cost systems were first developed in the 1800s, early 1900s, emphasis was on simplicity because cost and activity data had to be collected by hand and all calculations had to be done with paper and pencil. As we've moved towards having automated data collection systems and computers, it's much easier to collect a wide variety of accounting information and to process that information. So companies have been able to move away from a single plant-wide predetermined overhead rate towards activity-based costing, which uses a number of different cost pools and cost drivers, which is the subject of this chapter. Second, back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, most companies produced a limited variety of very similar products. So it didn't really matter too much how we allocated overhead. For example, if we only have one product, it doesn't matter if we allocate overhead on the basis of machine hours, direct labor hours, or any other allocation base. That one product will be assigned all of our overhead cost. But as companies say, such as Apple Computer, are now offering a multitude of products that consume different amounts of overhead. Allocation of overhead becomes much more important. We've got Apple making iPods, iPhones, MacBooks. We've got their iTunes stores and a variety of different products consuming different amount of overhead. And so allocating overhead accurately becomes a much more important job for companies. In early manufacturing firms, typically, in the interest of simplicity, a single plant-wide overhead rate was used to allocate overhead throughout our entire factory. And direct labor was typically the obvious choice for allocating overhead because information on direct labor was already being collected and recorded in the form of time cards, time sheets, etc., because we have to pay our workers and we have to keep track of those labor hours already. In addition, direct labor was a large component of our product cost. Our factories weren't very automated. Most of the work was done by hand. And finally, managers believed that direct labor and overhead costs were highly correlated. In other words, a lot of the costs we were incurring in overhead were being driven by the fact that we had workers engaged in direct labor. So again, without computers and automatic data collection systems, we wanted to focus on something that was already being gathered, and that was direct labor. Direct labor was a large component of our product costs, and we thought it was a large driver of our actual overhead costs. Over time, conditions have changed in three ways. One, most companies sell a large variety of products that consume different amounts of overheads, as we mentioned Apple, and so our allocation of overhead between products and cross products becomes much more important. Second, as a percentage of our total cost, direct labor has been shrinking over time as we become more and more automated. And as we become more and more automated, our overhead costs have been increasing. And a lot of these costs aren't directly correlated with direct labor. And then finally, as we already mentioned, technology advancements today have reduced the cost and complexity of gathering accounting information. And so for these three reasons, a plant-wide predetermined overhead rate might not be the optimal way for companies to assign overhead to products. We're going to look at two different systems for allocating our overhead for products. First, we're going to consider departmental-wide or departmental allocation schemes, and then we'll finally look at, which is the primary topic of this chapter, activity-based costing. If our company has multiple processing departments, it might make sense to hold managers of each one of these departments accountable for overhead being incurred within their departments. So to do this, we will keep track of overhead on a departmental basis. And once we're keeping track of overhead on a departmental basis, it typically will make more sense then to assign overhead on a department by department basis to products as they move through the various departments in our factory. So for instance, in our machining department, if it's highly automated, we might choose to assign overhead costs incurred in the machining department on the basis of, say, machine hours. But our assembly process and perhaps our shipping departments, they're very labor intensive, and we might continue to allocate overhead within those departments on the basis of direct labor hours. So instead of having a single plant-wide predetermined overhead rate, we'll have multiple predetermined overhead rates. A single predetermined overhead rate for the machining department, a single predetermined overhead rate for the assembly department, and say a single predetermined overhead rate for the shipping department. While use of departmental overhead rates is probably more accurate than using a single plant-wide predetermined overhead rate, departmental rates will still not correctly assign overhead cost in situations where a company has a vast range of products and very complex overhead costs. This is because the departmental approach relies exclusively again on volume-related allocation base, and some overhead costs may be caused by factors that are not related to volume of production. For example, we talked about our machining department based on machine hours. Well, machine hours is driven by units that we process. As we process more units, we'll run our machines more and have more machine hours. In our assembly department, we talked about allocating on the basis of direct labor hours. As we assemble more products, we will incur more direct labor hours. So again, a volume-related activity base. And we do have costs that are incurred that are not really related to levels of volume or activity. For instance, product design. It doesn't matter how many units of a product we produce, we still incur a set amount of time designing each one of our products. So we might want to think of another way to assign or allocate product design costs. And that's where we're going to introduce the concept of activity-based costing. It's a more sophisticated approach and it's costly to implement, but we're going to talk about some of the benefits and how they might outweigh some of the additional cost in processing or tracking cost on an activity-based system. So again, in activity-based costing, we're simply going to take our overhead cost pool and break it into a number of smaller pools. And hopefully, we'll use a number of allocation bases to assign cost to products that more closely drive or are more highly correlated with these actual costs. So again, in activity-based costing, we'll use a number of allocation bases to hopefully assign costs more accurately to products than if we had used a simple single plant-wide predetermined overhead rate or departmental overhead rates. The basic idea of an activity-based costing system is as follows. A customer order, a cost object, a product or a customer, triggers a number of activities. And these activities then cause us to consume resources. And as we consume resources, we incur overhead costs. The basic idea then of our activity-based costing is to look at our cost and our consumption of resources and trace them back upwards and identify the activities or cost objects that are driving our overhead costs. So an activity is an event that causes the consumption of some overhead resources. Some examples of activities might include setting up machines, admitting patients to a hospital, billing a customer, or opening a bank account. All of these activities will cause a business to incur an overhead cost. So as we consume resources and incur cost, we're going to want to track those costs and try to trace them and allocate them directly to these various types of activities. When we calculated a single plant-wide predetermined overhead rate, we took our total estimated overhead cost and divided it by some estimated activity level to calculate our predetermined overhead rate. For our activity-based costing system, instead of using a single cost pool, we're slicing our overhead up into various activity-related cost pools. Once we've sliced our overhead into various activity-related cost pools, we're going to identify what allocation base do we want to use to apply that particular overhead. And we will then simply calculate a predetermined overhead rate, which in activity-based costing we call an activity rate. So instead of having one predetermined overhead rate, in activity-based costing we will have multiple predetermined overhead rates. And again, we'll call those activity rates, but they're calculated in the exact same way. We're taking an estimated cost and dividing it by some estimated level of activity. For each activity that we're undertaking, we're going to allocate overhead just like we did on our job order cost system in Chapter 2. We'll take our predetermined overhead rate and then multiply it by some actual level of activity that we spent working on a particular job or product. Our challenges in an activity-based costing system is to select a reasonably small number of activities that explain most of the variation in our overhead costs. So again, we're always going to be faced with a cost-benefit trade-off. The more cost pools we use, probably the more accurate our product costing will be, but gathering and processing, doing our calculations and applying overhead on a multiple basis gets to be rather expensive. So we want to always step back and evaluate what's the cost of using more and more cost pools versus what's the added benefit of using additional cost pools. In terms of selecting the proper number of activities or allocation bases, we'll sit down and we'll talk with a number of managers, we'll talk with engineers, accountants to find out what activities within our organization do we think are causing us to consume most of our resources. And again, as we choose our activities, one thing we want to keep in mind, not only does activity-based costing give us more accurate product costing, but more importantly, often it helps us identify activities that are causing us to incur a significant amount of overhead cost, but don't provide a lot of benefit. For example, in the automobile industry, back 20 or 30 years ago, every single model car we had its own radio, its own door handle, its own bumper, its own engine. And when companies started examining from an activity-based costing system how much it was costing them to have a unique radio, door handle, bumper, windshield wiper, etc. on a car, they realized that parts were very expensive. We spent time and consumed resources designing parts, testing parts, putting out bids for parts to be manufactured, then maintaining inventories of separate parts. And so we realized that our customers probably didn't care if we had a unique windshield wiper or radio in one model car to another, and yet we were incurring a lot of cost to have unique parts for each one of our models. So over time, the automobile companies have eliminated a lot of their parts and a lot of their design cost, a lot of their testing cost, a lot of their bidding cost, a lot of their inventory and parts management cost, by instead of having a unique radio for every car and a unique windshield wiper for every car, we might have 2 or 3 different windshield wipers that we use across all of our models of cars. So in activity-based costing, not only did we get better cost information by stepping back and looking at and identifying cost pools, we said, why are we spending so much time with design time? Why are we spending so much time on product testing? What is the benefit of these things? And going through this process of setting up an activity-based costing system caused us to identify and then eliminate costs that didn't have a lot of value added to our end consumer. And that's probably the bigger benefit in activity-based costing, more over and above that of providing us with more accurate cost information. In designing our activity-based costing system, related activities will frequently be combined to reduce the amount of detail and record-keeping costs. For example, several actions might be involved in handling and moving raw materials, but these will be combined into a single activity simply titled Material Handling Costs. And then once we've set up this single cost pool, we'll decide on what allocation base should we use to allocate this cost. A common framework for thinking about our cost in an activity-based system is by looking at a hierarchy of activities. We'll have identify unit level activities, batch level activities, and product level and facility level activities. Unit level activities typically involve processing of units on machines or processing units by hand, consuming factory supplies. Their activities that we incur as we process additional units of output, and we'll typically allocate those, say, machine hours, direct labor hours, number of units produced. Then we have batch level activities, like processing purchase orders, production orders, setting up equipment, and we'll typically allocate those on numbers of purchase orders, production orders, machine setup, etc. Then we have product level. This would be designing new products, testing new products, administering parts for new products. And then we also then finally have facility level. And these are costs that we're going to incur that really aren't related to the number of products we have, the number of batches we have, or the number of units we produce. For instance, the cost of our plant and building and grounds, those will not vary directly with the number of units produced, the number of batches we run, or product level. And typically our facility level cost, we need to figure some activity based, and quite often it's not a very good allocation base, but we might use direct labor hours or say machine hours or some other per unit type of thing to allocate our facility level costs. So using activity-based costing, our manufacturing overhead costs are going to be allocated to products using sort of a two-step process. In the first stage, overhead costs are assigned to cost pools. Here we've got 6 different types of cost pools, for example. We've got labor-related cost, machine-related, setup-related, production order-related, parts-related, and just sort of the general factory, which is our overall catch-all. And then the second stage is simply calculating a predetermined overhead rate for each one of these cost pools. So we'll take our direct labor cost divided by direct labor hours, our machine-related cost divided by machine hours. So we've calculated these are our predetermined overhead rates. And then we'll apply the predetermined overhead to our products using our rate multiplied by an actual level of activity. And again, some of these we could classify as unit level, some as batch, some as product, and some as facility level. Let's consider some examples. The following activities occur at the Greenwich Corporation, a company that manufactures a variety of products. Classify each of the activities either a unit level, batch level, or product level, or facilities level. Various individuals manage the parts inventories. That's going to be a product level because every product has unique parts to it. The number of parts we have doesn't depend on volume or units produced, but varies on a product by product basis. A clerk in the factory issues a purchase order for So a clerk in the factory issues purchase orders for a job. That would be batch related. Each job by job we have purchase orders. The personnel department trains new production workers. That's not related to a unit level. That's not related to batch level or even product level. That's going to be facility level because those workers can work on any of our products. The general factory manager meets with other department heads to coordinate plans. That also is going to be a facility level. It's not varying by the number of units, number of batches or products that we produce. Direct labor workers assemble products. The more units we produce, the more direct labor we will incur. So that's going to be unit level. Engineers design new products. We need to spend a certain amount of design time on each product, so that's going to be product related. The material storekeeper issues raw materials to be used in jobs. We don't get raw materials every time we make one more unit. We go, hey, I need another 2x4. Hey, I need another piece of steel. We do it on a batch by batch basis. The maintenance department performs a periodic preventive maintenance on general use equipment. The fact that it's general use equipment suggests that it will be facilities related. Some of these classifications might have multiple or alternative classifications, sort of depending on our specific circumstances found, but this is probably a pretty good matching.